Let's break down 4 sneaky starts at running back and wide receiver heading into week 17 of the 2024 fantasy football season and go over the best streaming option at quarterback and tight end as we approach championship weekend. All right, let's kick the video off with Amir Abdullah of the Las Vegas Raiders coming off of a very nice performance in week 16 as well as week 15, 19.5 fantasy points in week 16, 19.6 in week 15. And the big thing with Amir Abdullah is that he gets that pass catching upside, right? 6 targets this past week, 7 targets in week 15, at least 5 receptions in each of those games, and a touchdown in each of his last 2 games as well. Now, he sits at 36% roster, so this is a player that you can run to the waivers to pick up if you have a hole in your starting lineup here in championship week in week 17. But the elephant in the room, of course, is that Alexander Madison's probably out there and available, a little bit higher rostered, sitting at 59% rostered. And he, of course, is also coming off of a good game against the Jacksonville Jaguars with 15.6 fantasy points. But I just feel as if Amir Abdullah has a bit more upside, although Madison did have 4 receptions off of 7 targets this past week. That was kind of an anomaly when you really break down what he's done on the season. He hasn't seen a ton of receiving work, or at least hasn't seen a ton since like week 8 of the season. And Amir Abdullah has, at least in the last 5 games, had 6 or more targets in 3 of those games. So just brings a little bit of a different element to the table. But either of these running backs for the Raiders are extreme emergency options going into week 17. And some people might even consider them just decent options going into the week. This Saints run defense is not good whatsoever, giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs on the season. And both Madison and Abdullah just took advantage of a very weak Jacksonville Jaguars run defense in week 16. So if you're desperate for a running back in week 17, you need somebody to fill in. We got Amir Abdullah sitting at 36% rostered and Alexander Madison sitting at 59% rostered. And they both have a great matchup on the road against the Saints in week 17. All right, next running back I'm going to talk about is Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars. And yeah, I mean, there are issues. I mean, we're going over emergency situations, sneaky starts, right? And at least Tank Bigsby's coming off a game where he had 10.1 fantasy points, 12 touches on the ground, 50 rushing yards, 4.1, 7 yards per carry, 8 touchdown, and 1 catch. But, you look at ETN and Bigsby, both of the running backs on this Jags team over the past couple weeks, it's been extremely inconsistent. We have 2 double-digit performances in the last 4 games for ETN and 2 for Bigsby. So this could really go either way, but Travis Etienne still sits at 84% rostered, where Tank Bigsby is sitting at 57% rostered. So you at least have a chance out there on the waivers if you're in a spot where you need some sneaky upside. And this Titans run defense has just gone completely out the window. They are now giving up the 28th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. This run defense for the Titans is just not good whatsoever. As a matter of fact, in week 14, the last time the Jaguars played the Titans, Travis Etienne had 11 fantasy points and Tank Bigsby had 13.2 fantasy points, 55 yards on the ground in that game, a rushing touchdown, and 1 reception for 7 receiving yards. So listen, I know Bigsby probably is going to get you very excited, but if there's nothing better, you're in a tough situation, you're one of these players who you're relying on Alvin Kamara this week, you got nothing on your roster, whatever it may be, Tank Bigsby does have some nice upside. Like I said, double digits the last time he played the Titans, and this could go either way. Don't get me wrong, just like the Raiders backfield could still go a little bit either way between Abdullah and Madison. But I think in terms of who's out there on the waivers, looking at matchups, Tank Bigsby could have some sneaky upside going into week 17. Let's move on to a few wide receivers, and let's start with Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. And we just talked about inconsistency. I mean, that is basically exactly what Romeo Doubs has been this season, coming off a game where he had just 4 fantasy points, although he wasn't really needed in that matchup against the Saints. The week before, after missing 2 games, he had 19 fantasy points against the Seahawks, just 5 targets, just 3 catches, but turned those 3 catches into 40 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. And you gotta love the matchup this week against the Minnesota Vikings, giving up the most fantasy points to wide receivers believe it or not, but we've talked about this all season long. This Vikings secondary has been very allowing to opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. It's a great defense. They have a great front seven. They're good at getting after the quarterback. They're great at stopping the run. They're not so great in terms of a secondary, and they allow the most fantasy points to wide receivers, point blank, period. The other thing going on here is that we have Christian Watson very questionable going into the week, dealing with a knee injury. If Watson is out, that's going to open up a lot more volume for Romeo Doubs, right? I know Jaden Reed's going to be your number one option here, and you can always see Dontavion Wicks step up, Tucker Kraft step up. But like I said, this defense is very good against the run. I still think Josh Jacobs is going to be fine this week. Don't get me wrong. I'm not down on Jacobs in any way, but I do think that this game script could turn into a game script where the Packers need to throw the football more. And, not just because the Vikings are good at stopping the run, but also because this is going to be a good competitive game overall where both teams are going to need to employ all of their offensive weapons, right? This is a big game in terms of divisional seeding and just overall in terms of playoff seeding. So I like Romeo Doubs. I think this is one of those games where he'll actually show up, although it's always hard to judge when we're looking at these Packers wide receivers, but I think he has a very good shot at having a decent game going into week 17. He sits at 58% rostered. It's a great matchup. Pay attention to the Christian Watson injury, especially if Watson misses week 17. I think that Romeo Doubs has plenty of sneaky upside going into the weekend. Next wide receiver I'm going to talk about is a wide receiver we've been talking about for quite a few weeks now, and that is Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who draws his toughest matchup in a few weeks going up against the Panthers, giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But we look over the last 3 weeks. We've talked about Jalen McMillan a ton the last 2 weeks as a good flex option, and he has shown up. 4 touchdowns in his last 3 games, 16.7 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games, 7 targets, 5 catches, 57 receiving yards, and a touchdown in that week 16 matchup against the Cowboys. But what I like here going into this week, even though it's not a great matchup, and I've said this all year long, the Panthers have not been bad against opposing wide receivers. I know people have, kind of come to their senses when it comes to the Panthers defense as of late, although they still have plenty of issues, especially against the run. But the point is, you can't just start anybody against this Panthers team and think that they're going to have a great day. They're not that bad of a defense. They're just god-awful against the run, right? But nonetheless, what I like here is that the game script's going to be very positive for the passing game. Of course, this Bucs team is going to be able to come out, run the football with Bucky Irving and or Rachaad White because this Panthers team is so bad against the run. But ultimately, I do think that the Panthers are going to put up a bit of a fight here on the road against the Buccaneers, and this is a must-win game for the Buccaneers. Getting to the point here, they're going to do whatever they can to beat this Panthers team because they have fallen out of the playoff race. They have to win this game, and they have to win in Week 18, and they need a loss from the Falcons as well. Don't forget, the Falcons have the tiebreaker, so all the pressure is on after that loss to Dallas this past week. We're going to see the Bucs come out here. Baker Mayfield sling it. We're probably going to see a lot of Bucky Irving and probably a good bit of Rachaad White as well and that run game against this Panthers run defense. But I still think Mike Evans, Jalen McMillan are going to have to step up here. Don't forget, Sterling Shepard's banged up. Cade Otton's banged up. Neither of them are playing in Week 17. So this is your number 2 receiving option. I mean, you could argue maybe the running backs here because we do see them get quite a bit of volume. But what we've seen out of McMillan over the past couple of weeks, this is your number 2 option behind Mike Evans. Hands down, must-win game for the Buccaneers. McMillan still only sits at 57% rostered with double digits in his last 3 games and at least 1 touchdown in each of his last 3 games. He has a ton of sneaky upside as a player you can grab off of waivers more than likely right now and roll with into championship weekend if you need the help. All right, let's move along to my favorite streaming option at quarterback this week, and it's going to be in that same matchup we just talked about. It's going to be on the opposite team. That is Bryce Young of the Carolina Panthers, coming off of a big performance in Week 16 against the Arizona Cardinals with 27 fantasy points, 17 of 26 throwing the football, 158 passing yards, not great, but he threw for 2 passing touchdowns, and he had 68 yards on the ground and ran for a touchdown. Bryce Young has a rushing touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games, including in Week 13 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where he had 23 fantasy points. And the Bucs, this secondary has been really bad all season long, but they've also just been really bad against opposing quarterbacks. Really, just they're good against the run, and that's about it. But they've given up the 31st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season. The Panthers are on the road here, but this is a great matchup for Bryce Young. Like I said, coming off of a big game. Had a big game in Week 13 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Panthers have shown they're not just going to keel over. They're not just going to roll over and let the Bucs stomp them because the Panthers are out of playoff contention, right? And the Panthers are really trying to see what do they have going into next year and how many snaps can we get out of Bryce Young and, what is a game plan for next year, essentially. And I think they're going to come out here and put together a competitive game script against the Buccaneers. So if you're in a bad spot, Bryce Young only sits at 18% rostered. This is a player you can pick up right now, and I honestly think this is one of the very best streaming options at the quarterback position going in to championship weekend. All right, and I've waited all video to talk about my favorite streaming option at tight end in Week 17. That is Chig Okonkwo, coming off of 2 monster games, 19.1 fantasy points in Week 16, 11 targets, 9 grabs, 81 receiving yards, and a still maybe not a monster game, but a very good game in Week 15 where he had 13.9 fantasy points, and he gets a smash matchup this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, giving up the 26th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. And in the last 2 games, in the last 2 weeks of fantasy football, Chig Okonkwo is the tight end 1 in all of fantasy football, just in case you're wondering. The good news is that Mason Rudolph is starting at quarterback this week, and in the last 2 games, Mason Rudolph has been the starter. So I was a little bit worried, like if Will Levis got the start, which there were rumors about after Rudolph threw 3 interceptions this past week, but Rudolph's going to get the start here. So I don't think this volume for Chig Okonkwo is going anywhere. And I mean, he's just got he's outpacing Calvin Ridley by a ton. He's the number 1 receiving option on this team. Not Nick Westbrook-Akine, not Tajay Spears at the running back position. It has been Chig Okonkwo over the last 2 weeks. I mean, he's completely outpaced Calvin Ridley. I'm not saying that's 100% going to happen this week, but I wouldn't be surprised because the Jags have been getting torched by the tight end position all season long. So, I mean, this is literally one of my very favorite starts of the entire season when it comes to potential sneaky starts and streams, right? He sits at 22% roster. I'm laying it all out there. I'm riding or dying with Chig Okonkwo in the fantasy championship. I'm starting him in 2 or 3 of my leagues at the tight end position. And I think if you are absolutely desperate in a deeper format where maybe you have 2 flex spots, I think you could flex Chig Okonkwo this week. I think he's going to have another double-digit performance, has a ton of upside, has seen a ton of volume. The matchup is there. Everything is there for Chig Okonkwo to have another great week. I know this one might kind of feel like a trap, but I don't quite think it is. I think Chig Okonkwo is truly due for a great day in Week 17. So if he's out there and available and you need help, like I said, he's sitting at just 22% rostered, and he's due to help you guys bring home a championship here in Week 17. And that'll do it for today's video. There are your sneaky starts and streams, all players that you guys can go to the waiver wire and pick up last minute as well as we move in to Week 17 of the fantasy season and championship weekend. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I possibly can. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 17's weekend, please let me know. I'll answer as many of you guys as I possibly can. But most importantly, make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because we're going to have everything you guys need to wrap up the 2024 fantasy football season and everything that you guys need going into the 2025 fantasy football season. It's been a great season here on The Catch. Just want to say thank you guys so much to each and every one of you. Hope you guys all had a great holiday and good luck in championship weekend. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.